Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to talk about the man pictured here, a likeness that is well known to all of you students of the Civil War, and probably many who are not big students of the war. William Tecumseh Sherman, General, United States Army. Sherman was no stranger to controversy. In fact, early on in the war, his peers and many others thought that he was crazy for his early predictions that the war was going to be a long, bloody affair that would cost an enormous amount of lives and treasure. The whole flower of a generation would be destroyed. Many, as I mentioned, thought he was nuts. But of course, in the end, he was exactly and regrettably right. Now, that early war story about folks thinking he was crazy is often taken out of context. But when you understand how Sherman came to his conclusion of this long, drawn out war, that prediction seems much more plausible, much more believable. Sherman tells us he explained himself in volume 2 of his 1875 book titled Memoirs of General William T. Sherman by himself. In it, he reflects on the years leading up to hostilities and how politicians and citizens missed or dismissed or otherwise ignored the growing mountain of evidence that the war was approaching, arguably unstoppable, and that Southerners, at least some group of folks in the Southern states, had every intention of fighting for their freedom in a second revolution. I read to you Sherman's perspective in his own words. He shares it in the last chapter of his memoirs. So let me share this with you. That chapter is titled Conclusion: Military Lessons of the War. So here we go. In the words of Sherman, having thus recorded a summary of events, mostly under my own personal supervision, during the years from 1846 to 1865, it seems proper that I should add an opinion of some of the useful military lessons to be derived therefrom. That Civil War, by reason of the existence of slavery, was apprehended by most of the leading statesmen of the half century preceding its outbreak is a matter of notoriety. General Scott, that's Winfield Scott, told me on my arrival at New York as early as 1850 that the country was on the eve of civil war, and the Southern politicians openly asserted that it was their purpose to accept as casus belli the election of General Fremont in 1856. That is, General John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, the first candidate of the nascent Republican Party. Sherman continues, but fortunately or unfortunately, he was beaten by Mr. Buchanan. That's James Buchanan, the Democrat. Sherman continues, which simply postponed its occurrence for 4 years. Mr. Seward had also publicly declared, that's William Seward, also publicly declared that no government could possibly exist half slave and half free. Yet, the government made no military preparation, and the Northern people generally paid no attention, took no warning of its coming, and would not realize its existence till Fort Sumter was fired on by batteries of artillery handled by declared enemies from the surrounding islands and from the city of Charleston. General Bragg, that's Braxton Bragg, the Southern general, the Confederate general, was certainly a man of intelligence and who, in early life, ridiculed 1,000 times in my hearing the threats of the people of South Carolina to secede from the federal union, said to me in New Orleans in February 1861 that he was convinced that the feeling between the slave and the free states had become so embittered that it was better to part in peace, better to part anyhow, and as a separation was inevitable, that the South should begin at once because the possibility of a successful effort was yearly lessened by the rapid and increasing inequality between the two sections from the fact that all the European immigrants were coming to the northern states and territories and none to the southern. The slave population, Sherman continues, in 1860 was near 4 millions, and the money value thereof not far from $2,500 million. Now, ignoring the moral side of the question, a cause that endangered so vast a moneyed interest was an adequate cause of anxiety and preparation, and the Northern leaders surely ought to have foreseen the danger and prepared for it. After the election of Mr. Lincoln in 1860, there was no concealment of the declaration and preparation for war in the South. In Louisiana, as I have related earlier in his memoir, men were openly enlisted, officers were appointed, and war was actually begun in January 1861. The forts at the mouth of the Mississippi were seized and occupied by garrisons that hauled down the United States flag and hoisted that of the state. The United States arsenal at Baton Rouge was captured by New Orleans militia, its garrison ignominiously sent off, and the contents of the arsenal distributed. There were as much such acts of war as was the subsequent firing on Fort Sumter, yet no public notice was taken thereof, and when, months afterward, I came north, I found not one single sign of preparation. It was for this reason, somewhat, that the people of the South became convinced that those of the North were pusillanimous and cowardly, and the Southern leaders were thereby enabled to commit their people to the war nominally in defense of their slave property. Up to the hour of the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861, it does seem to me that our public men, our politicians, were blamable for not sounding the note of alarm. When the war was actually begun, it was by a call for 75,000 90-day men, I suppose to fulfill Mr. Seward's prophecy that the war would last but 90 days. The earlier steps by our political government were extremely wavering and weak, for which an excuse can be found in the fact that many of the Southern representatives remained in Congress, sharing in the public councils and influencing legislation. But as soon as Mr. Lincoln was installed, there was no longer any reason why Congress and the cabinet should have hesitated. They should have measured the cause, provided the means, and left the executive to apply the remedy. Of course, it didn't happen that way. And Lincoln had to scramble to push the agenda to build an army, to build a navy, to work with the individual states, to create an army first of 75,000 and then 300,000 and more recruits for the 4-year war effort. So that is the Sherman commentary on what he saw. And I think it helps explain why those charges of him being crazy in the war are based on the reasons he gave here. So there you have it. Sherman, his memoirs, and the reasons why he thought that the war was going to be a long and drawn out affair. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War research trail.